Hello everyone, welcome to the JW Review. My name is Mike Felker, and we are looking at the Watchtower, May 2022, study article number 20 titled, Revelation, What It Means for God's Enemies. Last week in the review, I would highly recommend watching that because it's a little bit of a primer, a bit of an introduction to the idea of a preterism. And in this context, we're talking about the book of Revelation. So preterism in general would say that most of the book of Revelation has been fulfilled. Okay, so everything except for the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment. Everything else has been fulfilled. And that would really be the events leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So when John starts out writing the book and he talks about things that are soon to take place, the preterist really tries to put himself into the shoes of a first century reader and how they would understand that phrase soon to take place. And so they would be reading the whole book of Revelation in light of that context, a first century reader, and what they would be thinking about. So when we read the book of Revelation, we should always, really this is for any Bible book, we should always be putting ourselves in the shoes of the original audience and finding out how they would have understood it. And from there, of course, we can make applications to ourselves, to our context, so on and so forth. But first and foremost, how was the original audience understanding phrases like soon to take place? Or if Jesus says, I am coming quickly. All right, we look at all those clues and we come to our conclusions as best we can. And interpreting Revelation is no easy task. It's not something that we should be overly confident in. I think you can be confident. I think you can have some firm conclusions, but just be careful, be cautious in how confident you are, making sure you've looked at a wide variety of viewpoints and just consider those things, and just to be humble with the fact that maybe you don't understand it all, and maybe you can be corrected on a few things. So I think that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, because the book of Revelation, I think everyone can agree that it's written sort of cryptically. And I think there's a good reason for that, because if you would imagine if you were in just a Roman community, you were a faithful Jew in a Roman community in the year 64 AD, and you received this letter. And the Romans came along and they found this letter and they read it, and they'd be like, I don't know what in the world this letter is saying. It's talking about beasts and seven-headed dragons and all this kind of stuff, and they're just going to think it's like hogwash. It's these weird Jewish people are believing weird Jewish things. It's going to be pretty cryptic to an untrained audience. But if you're a faithful Jew who knows your scriptures, you're going to understand what these symbols mean. All right, and so it's so important that we view Revelation in that way, that all of these symbols, they're there for a particular reason. It's not intended to be straightforward and easy to understand to a modern reader like myself. We have to really look at what these symbols, and look at the Hebrew scriptures and see how the Hebrew scriptures use these particular symbols. So there's one book I do want to recommend. Someone asked me about book recommendation on preterism. One that I recommended was Last Days Madness by Gary DeMar. I would highly recommend that book. Now, when it concerns particularly the book of Revelation, hopefully you can see this okay, but I'm showing it on my Kindle. It's called Revelation 4 Views. All right, this is an updated version. It's by a guy named Steve Gregg. And this is really a commentary on the book of Revelation, but it's a parallel commentary in that it has 4 different views side by side, and Steve Gregg is trying to represent accurately these 4 views, and those would be the historicist view, the idealist view, the preterist view, and the futurist view. And so he's giving a parallel commentary on every single verse in the book of Revelation, showing how each school of thought understand these passages. And Steve Gregg, the author, is not even taking a side. I know what side he's on, but he's trying to just be objective in representing these views. So it's such a helpful resource. Just, if anything, just to see how someone else from another perspective understand something, and maybe you can learn something from someone else. I mean, I'm not a futurist, I'm not an idealist, but I can learn a whole lot from those perspectives. In fact, my favorite commentary on the book of Revelation is by a guy named Beale. I think it's the New International Greek Text Commentary. I've got it here in my software. That's probably the most thorough commentary on the book of Revelation, and I love it, but it's from the idealist perspective, really common in the Reformed community, but I love it. His research is great. I don't agree with the conclusions, but the research is fantastic. So I think it's J.C. Beale, that's his name, so just look up Beale, B-E-A-L-E, in Revelation, and it's a pretty thick and well-researched commentary. So those are just a couple resources if you're curious. And I'm not saying you have to have these resources. I'm just saying if you are wanting to see what some other perspectives are, those are something that you can check out. If you just want to study the Bible on your own and just use concordances and dictionaries, that's fine too. Go at it. I'm not going to stop you. But those are just some resources that I would recommend if you're interested. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into this review. And one thing I will say about this is, as far as what the Watchtower is doing, they're not always doing something completely out in left field and totally fanciful. For example, like identifying the United Nations with the beast in Revelation 13. Like, they're not the only ones who do that. There's many other futurists just in the evangelical Christian community who will identify certain symbols in Revelation in the same exact way. So this is not just me taking shots only at the Watchtower or challenging only the Watchtower. This might actually challenge some other viewpoints, and I hope that's okay, and I hope we can all learn something from each other. In the last video, a lot of you asked some really great questions, and I would encourage you to continue to ask those questions, and maybe we can sharpen each other and learn something here. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into this this article. And the key text is Revelation 16:16, which says, "And they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Harmageddon," or as most Bibles translate it as Armageddon. Okay, so we're going to look at this this text in a little bit more detail in a little bit, so just hang tight on that. But let's look at paragraph 2. How can we remain steadfast in the face of Satan's attacks? One thing that will help us is to know what the future holds. For example, in Revelation, the Apostle John describes some of the blessings that we will soon enjoy. Among those blessings will be the elimination of God's enemies. So, why is it that we're going to soon enjoy these blessings? Says who? Well, if we look in the book of Revelation, in Revelation 1:1, and we looked at this last week, it says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his slaves the things which must soon happen." And in verse 3, it says, "The time is near." So again, if you're receiving this letter in the first century, what does "the time is near and must soon happen" mean to you? The only possible way around this is to go down to Revelation 1:10, which this article will cite again in a few paragraphs, but it's where John says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day," and John just says this in passing. So I just think you're reading a lot into this if you think this is the final day of the Lord, where you have final judgment, final resurrection, Jesus comes back, judges the enemies, and everything is completed, right? you're reading something in there, I think, to say that is what this is talking about. I mean, first of all, John says this in passing. He doesn't really describe it. And second of all, he uses a different construction. He doesn't say the day of the Lord. He could have used that language, and that is the language that's spoken about by the other Christian writers, but John doesn't use that language. He's using a possessive form of the word Lord. So the Lord's, it's his day. So for example, if you go into 1 Corinthians 11:20, it talks about the Lord's Supper. It's his supper. And so that's why some Bible commentators, even some very, very well-known and very well-researched commentators, for example, like Richard Bauckham, no small name, and there's plenty of other ones I can name, like J.C. Beale, they say this is just talking about Sunday. But at best, it's ambiguous. At best, it's ambiguous. I think it's just talking about Sunday. I'm willing to be proven wrong on that. I just haven't seen a compelling argument to prove that. So I think if you're a first century reader, you're looking at the word soon, and this is near, and you take those very seriously. And so you view these things in that light. Okay? All right, so I don't see any reason to say this is talking about a modern day, something that we will soon enjoy, when the text doesn't actually say that, at least not explicitly. Paragraph 3. In the very first verse, Revelation tells us that the information we are about to read is being presented in signs, that is, in symbolic language. This kind of perplexed me because I don't see the word signs in verse 1. It's just not there. So where is this coming from? In fact, I went to Bible Gateway and Bible Hub, and I looked at every single translation. Unless I missed one, I couldn't find a single Bible that actually used the word signs in Revelation 1:1. So I tried to figure out, well, what does this mean? And so, of course, I went to the New World Translation, which says, a revelation by Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his slaves the things which must shortly take place. And he sent his angel and presented it in signs through him to his slave John. So the New World Translation has signs there. And if you go up to the Kingdom Interlinear, which I have pulled up here, the word signs is also there. It says, and he showed signs. So that Greek word, eseinamen, I think I'm pronouncing that right. But that word, regardless of how it's pronounced, that word is in most Bible translations as the word indicated. Okay, so if we're looking at Strong's, it says to indicate or signify. Now, signify doesn't mean the same thing as showing symbolic signs. So what does it mean? Well, let's look this up in our trusty little lexicon, BDAG, which is pretty much the standard lexicon for today, the most scholarly one of today. And that word means to make known, report, or communicate. So you're reading a lot in there to say that means showing signs. What we're talking about here is just simply reporting or making communication. All right, and BDAG actually cites Revelation 1:1 for that definition. Even if we go to the secondary definition, which isn't directly relevant to 1:1, we see to intimate something, respecting the future, to indicate, suggest, or intimate. And then the third definition is to provide an explanation for something. That is, enigmatic, mean, signify. All right? So it doesn't necessarily mean showing sign. It's just communicating, providing an explanation. It doesn't mean that. So what I've always been told, and the whole reason I bring this up is because we're always told that the New World Translation is one of the most readable, easier to understand, and also one of the most literal translations. But I find time and time again that they aren't so literal. They actually provide interpretations in the text. But that's not the job of the translator. The translator's job is not to interpret the text. They're just to show you what the text says. It's a job for the Bible student to interpret. That's your job, that's my job. But that's not the job of the translator. Even if it is true, and I think it is, that John is being communicated signs, which he's communicating to his readers. So yeah, it is absolutely symbolic language. But that's something you have to discover by looking at the context. So be a good Bible translator and translate what the word means and allow the reader to interpret it. Okay? So this is just one of those instances in passing where I just don't understand why the New World Translation does what it does. God's enemies are described symbolically. We see a number of wild beasts. For example, there is a wild beast ascending out of the sea. It has 10 horns and 7 heads. And that's in Revelation 13:1. That beast is followed by another wild beast ascending out of the earth. That beast speaks like a dragon and makes fire come down out of heaven. Then we see a different beast, a scarlet-colored wild beast, which is being ridden by a prostitute. That's really important, okay? These 3 wild beasts represent long-standing enemies of Jehovah God and his kingdom. Therefore, it is important that we identify them. All right, so me and the Watchtower, and then, of course, Futurists and others have very, very different viewpoints on what these beasts represent. Reading this as the first century reader, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm in the first century. These are soon to take place, and so I'm looking around me, and I have the Hebrew scriptures in my background, and I understand those. What is the best conclusion when I read these? Okay, so if I'm looking for these beasts and what these beasts represent, most preterists would say the sea beast is the Roman Empire, like long-standing enemy of God's people. You know, you read through Revelation 13 and then read through Revelation 17, but I would say 13 for the most part. 13 is the one mostly being described as far as that sea beast, okay? That's probably the heaviest description there. I think it's very reasonable if you're a first century reader to see that as the Roman Empire being represented by whatever Caesar or whatever emperor is there. And so you have the 7 heads of that particular beast. And so those 7 heads, who are the 7 Roman emperors? Because as we'll learn in just a second, the 7 heads are actually 7 kings. And who were they? So you have Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and then Galba, who had a very, very short reign. And so that's how a preterist understands it, and that's how a preterist would say a first century reader understanding it. Okay? That's who the sea beast is in Revelation. I'm sorry, the land beast in Revelation chapter 13. All right, paragraph 4. Before we can learn who these enemies are, we need to understand what this symbolic language means. The key to understanding it is to allow the Bible to explain itself. That is so important, letting the Bible explain itself. So if you don't know what something means, if you don't know what a beast is, or you don't know what 7 heads are, search in your Bible. Look in your Bible software. Do a search on the word beast, or look at different synonyms for the word beast, like certain animals specifically. If you don't know what heads are, look up the word heads. This is how we use the Bible to interpret itself. Okay. So I think that's actually a really good point that the Watchtower is making. Now, I think the Watchtower kind of leaves that in their interpretations, but in principle, I actually agree with what they're saying, and I think we should all follow that, especially when we're looking at Bible prophecy. Many of the symbols found in Revelation are already explained in other books of the Bible. Very true. For example, the prophet Daniel had a dream in which 4 huge beasts came up out of the sea. Daniel records their significance. These huge beasts represent 4 kings or governments. As I here read Daniel 7:15 through 17, so let's take a look at that. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions of my head kept alarming me. I came near to one of those who were standing by and began seeking out from him the exact meaning of all of this. So he said it to me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. So, yeah, this is really good to go back to Daniel. In fact, I think at least a couple of the chapters in the book of Daniel are essentially kind of like a foreshadowing commentary on Revelation 13 and Revelation 17 in terms of identifying what these beasts are, or at least giving you kind of more details. All right. So these great beasts, this is Daniel 7:17. These great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will arise from the earth. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come. So there is a sense in which you do have the beast that is the Roman Empire, but that's my interpretation. So I'm getting ahead of myself. There is a sense in which the beast represents just an empire or a government, but that empire government always has an emperor or a king within it. So you will find at times where it could be referring to the king, or it could be referring to that particular empire, and those could be interchangeable. But at least here in Daniel chapter 7 is saying that this is a king. Now, where it could be a little bit interchangeable is because the beast, which we're about to see, it has 7 heads. It has 7 heads, and what are those 7 heads, and what are those 10 horns? Those are all kings. So it's like you have different layers of kings. You have a beast, which is a king. You have heads, which are kings. Then you have horns, which are kings. So it gets a little bit confusing. But just bear with me here, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. So that clear explanation helps us to understand that the beast described in Revelation must also refer to political powers. Okay, fair enough, but it also has to refer to a king at the same time, because the king represents that particular empire. Okay, paragraph 6. What is the 7-headed wild beast? And they say read Revelation 13. Then I saw a beast coming out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on these horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon would be Satan, the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain fatally. And his fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled and followed after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?" So again, put yourself, and if you don't have this preterist viewpoint, okay, but at least try to understand where a preterist is coming from here, because we're trying to read this like a first century Jew in the year 64 AD. I'm just picking a number. Okay, 64 AD is reading this. So if he's reading this, he understands that you have beasts, okay? Beasts typically aren't that good in a lot of cases. You have Satan involved, giving power. You see this beast having great authority. Now, it does say the whole earth, okay? The whole earth. And so some may think that this refers to just the entire globe. But does it mean that? Does it have to mean that? Well, what does earth mean? Well, it's not using the word cosmos. Okay, it's just gay, the word gay. And that just means the inhabited earth. In fact, it's translated in that particular way in a number of places in the scriptures. So you have the land of Judah in Matthew 2:6. You have the land of Israel in Matthew 2:20. You can just go through these different passages. So now it possibly could mean the globe, but really it's about looking at the context and does it necessitate Does the context necessitate that it's going to be the entire globe? Maybe, or maybe not. Okay, and I'll give you an example, Matthew 24:14, where the gospel is preached to all the earth, and that may sound like it's like a global gospel proclamation, until you look at examples where the Apostle Paul said that he preached the gospel to all of the earth. I'll give you an example. I think it's in Romans 1:6. I know it's in Romans 1. Yeah, Romans 1:8, I was close. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout what? The whole world. And that actually uses the word cosmos there, which is a much stronger and universal world. But in Paul's day, was it being proclaimed throughout the entire globe? Well, no, but it was very widespread. So whole world doesn't have to mean global. So when you're looking at this in Revelation chapter 13 and you read whole earth, you just got to look at the context and say, does the context necessitate the globe? Or is it possible that it's referring to just a very, very wide area, or all of the known inhabited earth? But I don't see anywhere where the context requires the globe, especially if you're reading this as a first century reader. You know what kind of dominance the Roman Empire has, all right? And so this is where, as a first century reader, you're kind of putting all these puzzle pieces together, and I think it's very reasonable as a first century reader that you would see this beast is referring to the Roman Empire at the time, and the head who is slain fatally, I think that's referring to Nero and Nero's suicide, and there was probably not too many other greater persecutors of Christians in the first century than Nero. Nero was absolutely horrible in ways I can't even describe. Look him up and do some reading. You'll find it very fascinating and very, very disturbing. Now, Nero didn't come back to life. Okay, and this is where the beast kind of shifts from being talking about an actual king to talking about the empire, because when the emperor is gone, oh wow, is the kingdom or is the empire going to fall? Well, it may have looked like that when this great emperor committed suicide, but another emperor followed, and so that wound was healed. Okay, so I'm just showing you how a first century reader could read a text like Revelation chapter 13 and place it in his own context. Okay, so let's read the Watchtower's explanation here. We notice that this beast has a general appearance of a leopard, but the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion, and it has 10 horns. All of these are also features of the 4 beasts mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, which are described as kings. Daniel 7 says these beasts are kings. Yet here in the book of Revelation, these characteristics are combined into one beast, not 4 separate beasts. This wild beast does not represent just one government or world empire. It is spoken of as ruling over every tribe and people and tongue and nation. So it must be greater than any single national government. This wild beast then must represent all the political powers that have dominated humankind down through history. So there I think we have some stretching from what the text actually says. So first problem, I see it, is putting this in a modern context. And I don't think there's any biblical basis for putting it in a modern context. So that's the first problem I see. The second problem I see is combining like 4 beasts into one beast. And I don't see the text as doing that. Unless I'm misunderstanding something, I don't see the text as combining things into one beast. But you do have one beast that has all these heads and all of these horns. And so Daniel 7 identifies 4 beasts. So let's try to identify those in the context of Daniel's day. So in Daniel's day, You have the Babylonian Chaldean Empire, and that's represented by Nebuchadnezzar as the king. And after that, you have the Medo-Persian Empire, represented by evil Merodach. Then you have the Macedonian Greek Empire, represented by Neriglissar. And then you have the Roman Empire. So these empires are going from Daniel's day. All right, so the prophecies in Daniel started with his day, and they just expanded on down through the centuries. And so when you get to the fourth beast, that's the Roman Empire in John's day. That's the Revelation 13 beast, represented by Nabonidus. Okay, so that's how I'm identifying these in those original contexts, whether it's Daniel's context or John's context. All right. Now, what the Watchtower says about this must be greater than any single national government because it rules over every tribe and people and tongue and nation. Well, let me just ask you to go look up. You could just use your favorite web browser search engine and just type in Roman Empire 1st century or Roman Empire 70 AD or just pick a year. It may surprise you how much dominance the Roman Empire actually had, how far and wide it is expanded all throughout Europe, parts of Asia, North Africa. It was quite an amazing dominance by the Roman Empire, and they were just continuing to conquer from there. They wanted to dominate further, and the Roman Empire definitely fell centuries later. But I don't see why you would say this has to be greater than any single national government, unless you just assume that this is talking about global dominance, which I don't think the context requires. Okay, and I also don't think this has to be political powers that have dominated humankind down through history. That's what the Watchtower says. Again, I don't see the text as requiring that, really even hinting at that. Okay, paragraph 7. What do each of the 7 heads represent? A clue is found in Revelation chapter 17, which describes an image of the beast mentioned in Revelation chapter 13. In Revelation 17:10, we are told, these are 7 kings. These are 7 kings. 5 had fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet arrived. But when he does arrive, he must remain for a short while. Of all the this is the Watchtower talking now after citing Revelation 17:10, they say, of all the political powers that Satan has used, 7 have stood out prominently as heads. These are the world empires that have had a considerable impact on God's people. By the Apostle John's day, 5 of these had already appeared in the world scene: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. The 6th world power, Rome, was still ruling when John received the revelation. Okay, so what's really interesting here in this paragraph is, first of all, that they're correct in citing the passage that says the heads are 7 kings. Okay, these are kings. But second of all, they start to do the right thing about trying to place things in John's context. And that's really, really important. But I wish they would stay there in John's context and stop trying to find dual fulfillments or trying to find what this means in quote-unquote our day. So let me just expand on this idea about what these empires actually mean. And this is a note that I took, so I'm reading this note. The beasts are the empires, but sometimes also the king. It's kind of interchangeable. But the heads and horns are the kings. So Revelation 17:10 does tell us these are kings, both the heads and the horns. Okay, so here are the 7 heads, all from the Roman Empire, okay? Because this is the 4th beast. The 4th beast is the Roman Empire, and this empire has 7 heads. Okay, 7 heads within the Roman Empire, and we're looking at John's day, okay? So we have Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, Nero, and Galba. Now look at what it says here in Revelation 7:10. It says, when he does arrive, he must remain for a short while. Well, that's Galba. After Nero's suicide, Galba had a very short reign. So is it just coincidental that this really, really works out? That you have Nero dying, the beast was wounded, right? And then you have a king who reigns for a short while, Galba. Very, very interesting how this works out when you're reading this as a first century reader. I think it works out beautifully. Paragraph 8. As we will see, the prophecies in the book of Daniel help us identify the seventh and final head of the wild beast. Okay, so Revelation 17, 9, and 10 tells us that the seven heads are seven kings. Galba would be the seventh king who followed Nero. I don't think we need to read beyond that. Okay, so that's the seventh and final head of the wild beast. What world power has been ruling during this time of the end, during the Lord's day? So there we go again about the Lord's day. And that just seems to be what shapes much of their interpretations here, is just assuming that Lord's Day just means this day far into the future, the time close to the quote-unquote end. All right? And again, at best, I think that phrase is ambiguous, but I think it just means Sunday, and I think that's a very, very reasonable interpretation. In fact, I showed this last week, and this doesn't prove it, but it does say something that the most standard lexicon, the most scholarly lexicon that we have today, says the following, and this is BDAG. It says, pertaining to, belonging to the Lord. The Lord. It's just a day belonging to the Lord. And they say here, it is certainly Sunday. And they cite here Revelation 1:10. So I'm not saying you just have to believe BDAG or BDAG is like infallible. I'm not saying that, but it is the most scholarly lexicon, the most standard lexicon that most any Bible scholar worth their salt is using, and that is what it says. That has to mean something. But if it turns out that the Lord's Day is ambiguous, what does that do to your interpretation of Revelation? When you look at things that are soon to take place or must happen quickly, all right? They're going to happen soon. What does that tell you about that? So Watchtower continues, it is the combination, and here they are identifying this final head. They say, it is the combination of the United Kingdom and the United States of America. In other words, the Anglo-American world power. We may therefore conclude, all right, not that we think this is a good interpretation. They're not saying it with any reservation. They are concluding that it is the seventh head of the wild beast mentioned at Revelation 13, 1 through 4. Okay, so my note here says, how can this be multiple nations when Revelation 17:10 tells us that these were seven kings, and this final one is a king? So let me ask you a question. If this is a combination of the United Kingdom and the United States of America, who is the king? Who's ruling this? It's not one, that's for sure. What happens if the United States of America and the United Kingdom one day decide to go to war and oppose each other? Like, what happens then? And they no longer are any kind of alliances. So my other question here is, why can't this be the Roman Empire who ruled over many nations? Why can't it be that? And this is one of the challenges I have with futurism, is the interpretations are shifting sand based on what's happening in the world today, because governments change. Governments change. And if you look at the decades and decades of futurism trying to interpret this stuff, it's just constantly changing. There is never a conclusion. It's always changing. And I can almost guarantee you the interpretations are going to change tomorrow. So I say that just to caution you, especially if you're a Jehovah's Witness, to be very cautious in your conclusions, and very cautious in trusting the Watchtower and trusting their confidence that this definitely is the United Nations or just the United Kingdom and the United States of America. Just be careful in trying to put your trust in them when you know full well that could change. But yet the Watchtower requires that you believe them and that you don't believe anything differently, that you don't consider any other viewpoints except their own. Paragraph 9. Revelation chapter 13 goes on to tell us that this seventh head, the Anglo-American world power, also acts as a wild beast with two horns like a lamb, but it began speaking like a dragon. This beast performs great signs, even making fire come down out of heaven to the earth in the sight of mankind. Revelation chapter 16 and 19 describe this wild beast as the false prophet. Daniel mentions something similar, namely, that the Anglo-American world power would bring terrible destruction. This is exactly, notice the confidence here, this is exactly what happened during World War II. Does that sound like overconfidence to you? This is exactly, their words, what happened during World War II. If this is exactly what happened, are they saying that their perspective won't change from here? Do you want to, if you're a betting person, are you going to place bets on that? I'm not. The two atomic bombs that played a decisive role in ending that war in the Pacific were the result of a joint effort by British and American scientists. The Anglo-American world power, in effect, made fire come down out of heaven to the earth. So let me offer you what the, at least the most common preterist interpretation is. And that would be that this earth beast is actually apostate Israel in the first century, specifically the Sanhedrin, or the Jewish leadership at large. And these are the ones who were shown in the book of Acts to perform signs. And you can even see that they are described as false prophets in several places. So let's look at a couple of those. Acts 8:9. It says, "Now there was a man named Simon who formerly was practicing magic in the city and astounding the people in Samaria, claiming to be something great. And they all, from the smallest to the greatest, were giving attention to him, saying, 'This man is what is called the great power of God.' And they were giving him attention because he had for a long time astounded them with his magic arts." So that's pretty strong there. Acts 13:6. "And when they had gone through the whole island as far as Paphos, they found a magician, a Jewish false prophet, whose name was Bar Jesus." And then let's look at Acts 19:13. "But also some of the Jewish exorcists who went from place to place, attempting to invoke over those who had the evil spirits in the name of the Lord Jesus, saying, 'I implore you by Jesus whom Paul preaches.'" Okay? So you have these people in the first century, and these are just what is recorded here. There's no telling what else we have that was really there in the first century, and probably even some ones that are in the text that I'm not mentioning here. But could it be that in Revelation chapter 13, we're talking about these who are performing these great signs and fire coming down out of heaven? These are just symbolic ways of describing these false prophets in the first century who could actually perform very astounding signs and wonders that many people were coming to believe. Okay, so why not? Why can't that be the case? Okay. So when it's talking about the Anglo-American world powers bringing terrible destruction, they cite here Daniel chapter 8. I think if you're looking at this in Daniel's context and then the years following Daniel's day, this is actually referring to the empires of Daniel's day and following, leading up to Antiochus Epiphanes and his battle against the Jews and the defiling of the temple in 167 BCE. So if you're looking at Daniel chapter 8, in Daniel chapter 8 verse 20, you have the Medo-Persian Empire. Then in 821, you have the Macedonian Greek Empire. Why? So my question is, why stray from that and go thousands of years in the future and say this is referring to Anglo-American world powers? And if you want to see where I'm getting this, just go to Daniel chapter 8, verse 20. It says, "The ram which you saw with the 2 horns is the kings of Media and Persia." So those reading these, and I mean, look at verse 21. "Now the shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king." So if you're reading this in the years, or in Daniel's day, or the years following Daniel's day, why wouldn't you just view these as the kings that this is talking about? Why stray and think this is talking about something thousands of years into the future? I don't think the text or the context actually requires it. Paragraph 10. Next we see another wild beast. This one looks almost the same as the 7-headed wild beast, with the exception that it is scarlet colored. It is called the image of the wild beast and is described as an 8th king. And we're going to read some text here. Revelation 13:14. "And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which were given him to do in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life." And then verse 15, "And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed." And then you have Revelation 17:3. That says, "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns." Then they say, look at verse 8. "The beast which you saw was, and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast, that he was, and is not, and will come." And then in verse 11, "And the beast which was not, and is not, is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction." So, yeah, a lot of stuff about these beasts here. So let me just continue reading the Watchtower, and we'll talk about this a little bit. "This king is spoken of as coming into existence, then going out of existence, and then later reappearing. How well this description fits the United Nations organization, which promotes the interests of the worldwide political system. It existed first as the League of Nations. Then it went out of existence during World War II. It later emerged again in its present-day form." So the preterist interpretation, which I think would have been the first century interpretation, would be that the beast that was wounded was Nero's suicide. But the Roman Empire continued through the short reign of Galba, who remained for a little while, and that's exactly what Revelation 17:10 actually says. Okay, paragraph 11. "By means of their propaganda, the political beasts stir up opposition to Jehovah and his people. Symbolically, they gather the kings of the entire inhabited earth together to the war of Armageddon, which is the great day of God the Almighty." Okay, so if we're looking at this in the first century context and the events leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, it makes sense to see this battle of Armageddon as exactly that, where the Jewish people were attacked, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem fell, so on and so forth. Okay, but as far as the Armageddon and what that means, Bible scholars are just not totally sure, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. First of all, if you do a word search for this word in the Christian scriptures, it's only in one place, Revelation 16:16 is the only place where that word appears. So we've already got a little bit of a difficulty there. Now, what happens if we look this up in BDAG? What does it say? It says, Armageddon is a mythical place name said to be Hebrew in Revelation 16:16. It has been identified with Megiddo and Jerusalem, but its interpretation is beset with difficulties that have not yet been surmounted. In other words, we don't really know. We have some clues. For example, Megiddo. And if you look at that word in the Hebrew Scriptures, there's a couple of texts you can look at. You can look at Judges 5:19, 2 Chronicles 35:22, 2 Kings 9:27, and these are really in the context of great battles that occurred. So it's possible that Armageddon is really just a place name that means just a great battle, right? And the phrase itself might be kind of ambiguous unless you have a context. And so the context in the first century would be the events leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. In other words, it's not referring to the final battle after the millennium. It's not referring to that, but it's referring to the first century great battle leading up to 70 A.D. Paragraph 13, what does this mean for us? As Christians, we must be loyal to God and His kingdom. Amen. Yep. To do so, we need to remain neutral with regard to this world's political affairs. So remain neutral with regard to this world's political affairs. Are you remaining neutral in the world's political affairs when you are trying to actively go to the Supreme Court to get local laws changed in accordance with federal law? The Supreme Court, right? Run by what? Governments. Is that politically neutral? Now, it's one thing if you're forced to go to court and to testify and things like that. You're just standing trial. You're not doing anything political. You're not trying to change laws. Like, for example, if you go to court for free speech violations, if you truly are political neutral, you would just say what the early apostles did when they stood before the Jewish court and they said to the apostles, no longer go and speak this name Jesus. And the disciples basically said, we're obeying God rather than men. You can say whatever you want. You can bind us, persecute us, but we're going to continue to preach until you stop us. If you're truly politically neutral, you don't pursue government law and try to get it changed, even if the government law is inconsistent with itself. But what do the Jehovah's Witnesses do? They do exactly that. In fact, very prominent worldly people have said that the Jehovah's Witnesses have really done some of the most profound things in the name of free speech that have affected government law, right? That's what the world says. But is that really being politically neutral? They continue. Such neutrality can be extremely difficult, though, because the world's governments demand our full support, both in word and in deed. Those who succumb to their pressure receive the mark of the wild beast. Any who receive that mark, however, will incur Jehovah's disapproval and lose out on everlasting life. How important it is, then, for each one of us to maintain strict neutrality, no matter what pressure is put on us to do otherwise. So let me just ask again, is pressure put on the Jehovah's Witnesses to go to the highest courts, to pursue those highest courts, to hire your own lawyers to try to enact political change in the laws? I mean, I'm willing to be corrected on this, but I'm not sure I understand how it's politically neutral to do exactly that. But this paragraph here in paragraph 13 is very, very serious, because most of you watching know what happened for the Watchtower for about 10 years, where they became an NGO, a non-governmental organization with the United Nations. And you can look at the documentation for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Go look into this for yourself. You can Google this, NGO, Watchtower, Jehovah's Witnesses, United Nations, and you can have more than enough information, even directly from the United Nations themselves. And you can look at the support charters that any NGO was required to have in supporting the United Nations. And they had to sign down at the dotted line. And there's no way you can plead ignorance. The documentation does not. If this was going to court, the Watchtower would lose. They could not have been ignorant about what it meant to be an NGO with the United Nations for 10 years until they were found out and ratted out by a secular newspaper. The explanation does not work. Saying that you just wanted a library card, that does not work. Look into this for yourself. It does not work. So I just don't think there's good reason to believe that the Jehovah's Witnesses have successfully and always remained politically neutral. I think it's only politically or actually, let me say this another way. They leave the political neutrality when it benefits them. When it benefits them. Okay? Otherwise, they're politically neutral. Paragraph 16. In the scriptures, the term prostitute can refer to those who claim to serve God, but engage in some form of idolatry or in some other way to become friends of the world. By contrast, those who fully worship God are referred to as being chaste or as virgins. Ancient Babylon was a center of false worship. So then, Babylon the Great must represent all forms of false worship. In fact, she is the world empire of false religion. So, how is Babylon the world empire of false religion? Well, first of all, who is Babylon? Well, I think there's really good reason to believe that Babylon the Great was apostate Judaism in the first century. And if you want to look at do your own word search for the word harlot in the Hebrew scriptures, and you will see time and time and time and time again where Israel was described as a harlot and being engaged in prostitution, because time and time again they were going after other gods. And so, yeah, in the first century, I definitely think that Judaism was maybe not the world empire of false religion, but they certainly embodied false religion themselves, because what were they doing? They were compromising with the Roman Empire. Just look at the Jews at the time of Jesus, where they had no king but Caesar. They were giving in when it was convenient for them. They were giving in to the Roman Empire and changing their allegiance over to the Roman Empire when the Messiah was standing right there before them. But just another interesting clue, look at Revelation 11:8 and what it says. It says, "And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified." To a first century reader, what do you think that would have meant to them? Where was their Lord crucified? So if Jerusalem is the great city and it can spiritually be called Sodom in Egypt, is it too far-fetched to say that Jerusalem is also the harlot, Babylon the Great? Is that possible? Paragraph 17. What will happen to Babylon the Great? Revelation 17, 16, and 17 answers that question this way. "The 10 horns that you saw and the wild beast, these will hate the prostitute, and will make her devastated and naked, and they will eat up her flesh and completely burn her with fire." Sounds like what happened exactly in the first century with Jerusalem being destroyed. For God put it in their hearts to carry out his thought. Yes, Jehovah will motivate the nations to use the scarlet-colored wild beast, that is the United Nations, to turn on the world empire, false religion, and completely destroy it. And we're going to wrap it up here. I know this was a bit of a long one. Paragraph 18. Never would we want to allow ourselves to be influenced by the false teachings, the pagan celebrations, the lax moral standards, and the spiritistic practices of Babylon the Great. And we would continually call out to people to get out of her so that they can avoid sharing in her guilt before God. Now, here's where you can look at a first century context where Babylon the Great would be describing Jerusalem and take the principle of that and make application today. What is the principle? What is the application? If you're in false religion, get out of it. Get out of it. And what if it's the case, if you're a faithful Jehovah's Witness, what if it's the case that what you're in right now is what you need to get out of because of the compromises this religion has made with the God they claim to serve? They've compromised it. They have left the God they claim to serve. And they are now teaching false doctrine. And they are setting up men on a pedestal, having great authority, telling you to follow them and believe everything that they put in print. Do you really want to put your faith and trust in these fallible men? These men who are always changing their position, even though they tell you to believe everything that they say, or else we will have you disfellowship and shun you the rest of your life by all of your friends and family. Instead, follow the one who never changes. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is the great high priest. He is your mediator. And you don't have to be of a special class for that. Jesus can be your mediator, the mediator between God and man. And you can be reconciled to your heavenly Father through the blood of Jesus Christ. He can give you eternal life right now. You can be forgiven. And you can be assured right now that you will be resurrected and you have right now eternal life. And also, when it comes to Bible interpretation, you can have the freedom to examine these texts for yourself and arrive at your own conclusion. Because within the body of Christ, the real body of Christ, there can be peace, even in the midst of differing interpretations of these texts. Because my futurist friends, we can disagree about these things, but we can still fellowship together and love one another and even serve God together and worship together. Because we can have peace. Why? Because Jesus Christ is our peace. And we can come to the Lord's evening meal together and celebrate what Jesus has done for us, even if we differ on what the beast means. So, hope this was helpful to you. This might have aroused more questions than answers. That's okay. I just want to encourage you to study the stuff, ask questions. I can help if you have any questions for me, and don't be afraid to ask. Feel free to leave your comments, your questions down there below on YouTube, or if you're on my website, michaeljfelker.com. You can leave your questions or your comments there. I really appreciate everyone who leaves all of their encouraging comments. Thank you so much for doing that. Please, please, please don't stop doing that. You're not just encouraging me, you're encouraging other people out there who read these comments. Also, if you want to support this work, please consider subscribing to this if you're watching this on YouTube and hitting the like button. That helps with the algorithms, and also hitting that notification bell. And also, if you're listening to this via podcast, if you're discovering this for the first time, we're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts. Please consider subscribing there and also leaving me a review in Apple Podcasts. That also helps to get the algorithm going so this can be recognized. Also, if you can, I understand if you can't, please consider sharing this content with somebody who needs to hear it. And lastly, if you want to support this work financially, you can become a monthly supporter on Patreon. Just go down to the links below. You'll see a link there to become a monthly supporter. Every little bit helps. It basically helps to keep the lights on and covering the monthly and annual expenses that this kind of work requires because of the servers, the podcast hosts, the website hosts, and all that kind of thing. So everyone who's supporting us in every way, financially or not, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you all, and I just love doing this, and thank you all for just continuing to encourage me to keep this kind of work going and how much it's benefiting so many people, even those who I don't even get to hear from. Thank you so much all for listening, watching. Have a great week, and we will see you next week for more on Revelation, study article number 21, Revelation, what it means for your future. Have a great week. For more information about Jehovah's Witnesses and other topics, please visit michaeljfelker.com. There you can also reach me directly to submit questions or comments to be covered on the JW Review. To subscribe to this podcast, please go to iTunes and search for the JW Review.